All right, so today I'm going to be talking to you about one of the two components of Darwin's theory of evolution. I'll be talking to you about common descent. If you have not already watched the first PowerPoint regarding natural selection, you need to do that prior to watching this video. So just as a reminder from the previous video lesson, Charles Darwin is often referred to as the father of evolutionary theory. Now, this picture is of Darwin as a very old man. Now, Darwin came up with his ideas though when he was quite young. In the early 1800s, he was hired as a naturalist by the British Navy to travel around the world as they explored South America and the Pacific Ocean. And his job was to document plant and animal life that might be useful for sailors as they journeyed across the globe. One place in particular that really stood out to him was the Galapagos Islands, which was about 600 miles off the coast of South America. And he noticed that there were animals there that were similar to those on the mainland but distinctly different. And he also noticed from island to island within the archipelago there were similar organisms, but they had some distinct differences. And those travels and the specimens that he collected there really impacted his life and his thinking. So it was from those trips that he came up with his idea of how organisms change over time or evolve. And his theory had two major parts: natural selection, which was explained earlier, and which is how the environment favors some organisms based upon the traits that they exhibit. And then his second part of his theory was called common descent, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. So make sure you remember Darwin was the guy who published all of this in the mid 1800s and caused quite a stir around the world by throwing out some really controversial ideas at the time. So the second part of Darwin's theory, which is common descent, is the part that people struggle with the most. Natural selection makes sense, but common descent suggests that all organisms are related to each other and have descended over time with modification from a common ancestor. So make sure that you know that common descent is that idea that all living species are descended with changes or modifications over time from common ancestors. So what does that really mean? That everything that's alive on Earth today is related to each other. Now, some organisms on Earth are more closely related to each other than others. Some may share a very distant ancestor. So just think about the tree of life. Common descent explains how all living things are connected. So all living things are connected through a common ancestor. Some organisms have a more recent common ancestor and are therefore more closely related to each other. Other organisms share a very distant common ancestor and are less related to one another. So what evidence is there of common descent, which is one of the components of evolution? So make sure that you know that there are 4 lines of evidence that support common descent. You may want to write this down and number them. So the first line of evidence comes from looking at your geological timescale or fossil record. The second line of evidence looks at the anatomical structures that make up organisms' bodies. The third is molecular similarities. Specifically, we're looking at how similar DNA and RNA and amino acid sequences within proteins are. And then our last line of evidence comes from comparative embryology. So embryology is the study of how an organism develops from the time the egg is fertilized until it becomes a fetus, or when it starts to look like what it's supposed to be. So now let's take a look at each of those lines of evidence a little more closely. So again, our first line of evidence comes from the fossil record. So the fossil record allows us to see what organisms were on Earth in the past and how living or extant organisms evolved from those ancestors that may be extinct. So we can see from the fossil record how similar living organisms are to those who were on Earth many millions of years ago, or how different they are. We can hypothesize about the relationships among living species and those that are extinct based upon the similarities that we see with living species and fossils. And we can find connections between extinct dinosaurs and present-day birds through the fossil record. We can find connections between fish and organisms that are four-legged and lived on land, like amphibians, for example. So again, the fossil record shows us relationships between extinct organisms and those living today. The next line of evidence comes from comparative anatomy. Now, you're going to have a lot of words to write down from this slide, so you may want to pause it and write down the terms and their definitions. So comparative anatomy is looking at structures that make up organisms' bodies and seeing how closely they look alike or how they function to one another. So we've got three different types of structures that we need to know their definitions. We have homologous structures, analogous structures, and vestigial structures. Vestigial structures I'll talk about at the end because they're present but they don't do anything anymore. So homologous structures and analogous structures sound very similar. So you need to focus on one or the other. Either focus on their ancestry or focus on the function. So homologous structures have a common ancestor, but they do not have a common function. Analogous structures are the opposite. They have similar appearances and functions, but they have different ancestral origins. And then lastly, vestigial structures are things that are present, but they don't do anything anymore. So they're there, but they no longer have a function. And oftentimes they're much decreased in size. Now in the next few slides, we're going to look at some examples of each of these. So you may want to write down the examples now, or you can go back, or you can write them down as I go through the next few slides. So now let's take a look at homologous structures a little more closely. I'm going to focus on the diagram. The definition is the same as what you had on the previous slide. So an example of homologous structures comes from looking at the four limbs of mammals. So mammal would be the common ancestor, and then each of these have descended with modifications into their different functions. So if you take a look at the arm of a human, the forelimb or the front leg of a cat, the flipper of a whale, and the wing of a bat, you're going to notice that the bone structures are somewhat similar, but they've also been modified for specific functions. So if you notice this first bone, this is the humerus, and humans and cats look very similar, and even the bat looks similar in shape, but it's much smaller. But the whale's is very different. Right? It's shortened and compacted. Right? Then if you look down at the lower part of the limb, at the radius and the ulna, you're going to see that, the human and the cats looks more alike, with the exception here at the joint where the cat's bone elongates past it. The whale, again, is very different, short and compact. The bats are very thin, which allows for flight. Then the next set of bone are called the carpals. So the carpals are the bones of our wrist. All of them have carpals. And then the last set are metacarpals and phalanges. So these are the digits. And they've all been modified for the different functions. So the human hand, the cat's claw, the flipper of the whale, and then the wing of the bat. So again, these are homologous structures because they arose from the same ancestral mammal, but they no longer have a common function. All right, the next type of structure that we look at when we do comparative anatomy are analogous structures. Again, the definition is the same as the earlier slide. Analogous structures may look alike, so the bat wing, the bird wing, the butterfly wing, they're all wings, they are all used for flight, but they have different origins. So the bat wing evolved from an ancestral mammal, the butterfly wing from an ancestral insect, which is an invertebrate, and then the bird wing from an ancestral bird or possibly even dinosaurs. There are some dinosaurs that were feathered, more like the velociraptors, not pterodactyls. Okay, so again, analogous structures, they look alike, they do the same thing, but they have different ancestral origins. All right. The third type of structure, when we look at comparative anatomy, are vestigial structures. Again, the definition is the same as the previous slide. Just wanted to show you an example. So vestigial structures are things that are present but no longer have a function, and they're often much smaller in size as well. So in some species of whales, you'll actually find pelvic bones at the back of the body near the tail, suggesting that they evolved from an organism that once had 4 limbs. And there is evidence that whales were related to some land-dwelling animals similar to horses. Some snakes also have these pelvic bones, even though they do not have limbs, but they may have these bones present. Right. Now let's look at our third line of evidence. Our third line of evidence is from molecular data. Sometimes this is called bioinformatics. So we're going to be looking at molecular similarities. Specifically, we like to look at DNA or RNA and the amino acid sequences that result from them. So make sure that you know when we're looking at molecular similarities, we're going to look at the DNA, we're going to look at the RNA, we're going to look at the amino acid sequence of the proteins. And essentially, the more differences you have, the less closely related you are. The fewer differences you have, the more closely related you are. So the more you have in common, the more recent your common ancestor when we look at these molecules. All right, so let's look at how we interpret that. So I'm going to give you a couple of diagrams on the next slide that I want you to be able to read. So the first diagram we're going to look at is called a DNA fingerprint. So a DNA fingerprint is created using a process called gel electrophoresis. And organisms who are more closely related will have more banding patterns in common with each other. Now, gel electrophoresis or DNA fingerprinting is also used for solving crimes and also determining paternity when there's a question about who the father is of a specific child. We're going to use it from the standpoint of determining what species are more closely related to each other. So when you look at the gel or the DNA fingerprint, you want to look at the banding pattern going across, and you want to see which organisms share the most bands. So I'll ask you specific questions. So like my question today is, which organism is more closely related to species 1? So we want to see who has the most in common with species 1. Is it species 2, 3, or 4? So we want to look across the bands. So notice that all 4 species have the first band. All right. Then go down to the next band on species 1. It's present in species 3 and 4, but not in species 2. The next band is present only in species 3. The next band is present in 3 and 4. The next band is present in 2, but not in 3 or 4. And then the last band is present in number 3. So then we want to just kind of count up how many bands each one had in common. So species 2 had 2 bands in common with the ancestral species. Species 3 had 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 bands in common with the ancestral species. And species 4 had 1, 2, 3 bands in common with the ancestral species. So this third species is more closely related to the common ancestor. So those two are more closely related because they have more bands in common with each other. Now, another set of information that you may have to analyze is amino acid sequences. And remember, proteins contain hundreds or even thousands of amino acids. You're only going to be given a small segment, so it's not the whole picture. So just because an organism may have everything in common with each other for a short sequence does not mean that all of their amino acids are the same and not all of their proteins are the same. We're just looking at small bits of information to practice. So let's take a look at the human sequence of amino acids for a very short segment of the hemoglobin protein. And hemoglobin is a protein that carries oxygen throughout the blood. So I want to figure out which species is most similar to humans. So let's go through the first sequence of amino acids. So humans' first amino acid for this segment of hemoglobin is LYS, or lysine. The horse has arginine, so I'm going to X that one out. The gorilla and the chimpanzee have the same as the human. The zebra does not. Moving to the next amino acid, GLU, which is glutamine. Horses don't have that, but gorillas and chimpanzees do. Zebras do not. Notice that all of them contain histidine as their third amino acid in this specific sequence of hemoglobin amino acids. And then the last one, humans have isoleucine, horses have lysine, gorillas have lysine, chimpanzees have isoleucine, and zebras have arginine. So I'm going to mark out the ones that are different. So if you notice, which one has the most in common with the human? Well, that would be the chimpanzee. For these 4 specific amino acids, they are identical. And again, hemoglobin has thousands of amino acids, so this is just a small segment that we're looking at. So we can infer that humans and chimpanzees are more closely related to each other than the other species are to humans. All right, then you could also look at comparing from that same chart. You could figure out which species has the most in common with a horse, for example, or with the gorilla. So just keep in mind that you can compare multiple groups of organisms from one chart and make sure that you are able to do that. Our fourth line of evidence for common descent comes from comparative embryology. Now, comparative embryology, we're looking at the developmental stages of an organism as it's fertilized, goes from a fertilized egg or zygote all the way up to the fetus, which is when it starts to look like what it's going to be. So you want to look and examine these diagrams going down. Okay. So humans, monkeys, pigs, chickens, and salamanders in their fertilized egg stage look relatively similar to each other. You can see how the salamander has a pretty distinct nucleus. Same thing with the chicken. It's not as obvious with the human, monkey, or pig. Now, as you move through the late cleavage stage, you're going to see there's a really distinct separation between groups of organisms, and it occurs right here. You're going to notice that the human, the monkey, and the pig during late cleavage still look very similar to each other, and now the chicken and the salamander kind of look similar to each other. As we move through the body segment stage, humans, monkeys, and pigs still look very similar. They all have a tail. They all have gill slits forming. There's basically the curvature of the head that you see. You can see the little umbilical cord forming. As you move through the limb bud stage, again, very similar development. You can see the forelimbs developing. They still have tails. Okay. And the head still kind of turns downward. At this point, you can't tell what they're going to be yet. Moving to the larval fetus stage, you have your human, your monkey, and the pig. Now the human and the monkey look really similar to each other still, but the pig definitely looks different as the snout has formed. Now you have to look closely, but you can see differences between the human and the monkey a little bit in terms of the facial features, but one of the biggest differences is here. Monkeys still have the tail, whereas humans do not. And so that's one of the key distinguishing characteristics between monkeys and apes. Apes, which humans and gorillas and chimpanzees are all classified as apes, do not have tails, whereas monkeys do. So you can see that humans and monkeys share more of these stages in common, so they are more closely related to each other than the other 3 species that we have available for analysis. So remember, you're only analyzing the information that you're given. So sometimes you're not given every species on Earth. You would actually find out that there are some species that are more closely related to humans than monkeys, like gorillas and orangutans, and chimpanzees are more closely related to us than they are. So just keep that in mind. You want to notice how many stages they have in common. The longer they look alike, the more closely related they are. So make sure that you can look at those diagrams and infer evolutionary relationships from them. So now that we've talked about the lines of evidence that support the specific component of Darwin's theory of evolution, common descent, we're going to look at some people who actually influenced his way of thinking. Now, remember, Darwin came up with his ideas in the early 1800s, but he didn't publish anything until he was much older. Now, when Darwin was on that sea voyage that I talked about earlier when he went to the Galapagos Islands, he took a lot of books and scientific papers, publications with him, and he read a lot while he was on the ship. And he was particularly intrigued by the ideas of a few scientists, Lamarck, Lyell, and then Malthus. We're going to talk about Lamarck first. So Lamarck, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, publishes a theory of evolution that he called the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Make sure you write that down. So Lamarck's idea is this inheritance of acquired characteristics. It was one of the first ideas of how organisms evolve or change over time. And he believed that organisms could pick up traits during their lifetime and pass those traits on to their offspring. Now, his idea was really good in explaining why we saw specific traits in like crabs and giraffes, for example, but he kind of lost sight of the big picture, and people quickly pointed out some ways that this would be false. So, for example, let's say that I chopped off my thumb when I was slicing, onions in the kitchen. Well, according to Lamarck, if I had children after I lost my thumb, my child would also be born without a thumb, and that's not true. So just make sure you know Lamarck is important because he comes up with one of the first ideas of evolution called inheritance of acquired characteristics. And even though he was wrong, he got the ball rolling and he kind of broke the barriers that were around talking about evolution of organisms, because it was very controversial and frowned upon to question or do anything against the teachings of the church. So Lamarck lays the groundwork for at least a discussion and a debate about how organisms change over time. Now, another person that influences Darwin's theory and his way of thinking was a man by the name of Lyell. Lyell is a geologist. He is studying how the earth forms different features like mountain ranges, canyons, and he believed in uniformitarianism, which means that the speed at which these geological processes and forces have remained constant throughout time and always at the same frequency or intensity. And he suggested that in order for things like the Grand Canyon to form, Earth had to be millions of years old, not just a few thousands of years old, which was common belief in the early 1800s. And while Lyell said, hey, Earth's been around a lot longer than we actually think, he was still way off the mark because Earth is actually billions of years old, like around 4 billion years old. So Lyell is important because he gives Darwin the time frame that he needs for that process of natural selection and common descent to occur. So make sure you remember Lyell is the geologist who said the Earth was millions of years old, providing Darwin the time frame he needed for that process of natural selection to occur. So the next person who influenced Darwin was not a scientist, but actually an economist. He lived in London. London was a big city at that time in the 1800s, and he noticed that as the population of London grew, there was a struggle for existence. And people were dying from hunger and disease. There was a competition of who would survive. And Darwin said, well, if this happens within human populations, within cities, why can't this happen out in the environment? Why can't there be a struggle for existence in the environment, and the environment favors some individuals over others? So that kind of gave Darwin some of his ideas that put the pressure for organisms to change over time, or populations to change over time. And you may remember the phrase survival of the fittest. Well, that's kind of what he got from Malthus. Those organisms that were best suited for their environment would in turn survive and produce more offspring. So Malthus helps Darwin formulate some ideas along those lines. Now, the next person, or group of people, weren't scientists at all. They're the farmers. And farmers just kind of made Darwin aware of how we could take advantage, meaning humans could take advantage of natural variation occurring within species, or the differences among organisms, and how humans can pick out those traits that they want organisms to exhibit. We call that selective breeding or artificial selection. So artificial selection is when people pick out the traits they want an organism to exhibit. Natural selection is when the environment favors organisms with specific traits because they are better suited to live there. So Darwin just kind of makes the connection. Well, if people could pick out traits that they want organisms to have, why can't the environment pick out traits that are better suited for survival? So that's where the farmers come into Darwin's thinking. Now, the last person that I'm going to talk about was a contemporary of Darwin's. When I say somebody's contemporary, that means that they're alive at the same time. And Darwin's contemporary, Alfred Wallace, was kind of like his pen pal, so to speak. They were both interested in the same thing, and they communicated their ideas with each other quite frequently. Now, Alfred Wallace is sometimes called the co-discoverer or natural selection because he came up with essentially the same ideas that Darwin did after he traveled to a different part of the world. Darwin traveled to the Galapagos Islands off the coast of South America. Alfred Wallace traveled to the Malaysian archipelago in Southeast Asia, and he noticed things very similar to what Darwin had noticed on his journey to the Galapagos Islands, in that there were organisms there that were similar to each other on each of the islands, but they were distinctly different from each other. So Wallace is the co-discoverer or natural selection, but he's often overlooked because Darwin had a manuscript that he had been working on for 20, 30 years and just holding on to all this massive amount of data until he felt that it was time to publish. And what prompted him to publish was that he and Wallace presented together some of their observations in 1858 at a scientific meeting. After that, Darwin decided he was going to go ahead and publish his book, the famous On the Origin of Species. And so Darwin gets a lot of the credit for the idea because he had a lot of data to support his hypotheses, and he had written quite a lot about them, whereas Wallace didn't have quite the amount of evidence to support his ideas at that time. So Darwin often got more of the credit for it, even though Wallace came up with the idea independent of Darwin himself. So just make sure you remember that Wallace is the co-discoverer, natural selection. He had ideas very similar to Darwin, but Darwin got the credit because he wrote the big manuscript that basically took the world by storm.